Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, we had a FCPA enforcement action last week involving Telefono Venezuela, the Venezuelan subsidiary of the Spanish telephone giant Telefono. And it, I thought, had some interesting twist. It's at least some very interesting lessons learned for the compliance professional, even if the overall case might have seemed rather, if not mundane, perhaps routine. So you want to take it from there.
Sure. So I actually thought this was a pretty nifty example of how corporate corruption can work and why companies do corrupt things from time to time. So the settlement came from the Justice Department. We have not seen anything from nor am I certain that we will. But this happened in 2014, where Telefonica's Venezuela subsidiary, they are doing business in Venezuela. So they get paid by their customers there in Venezuelan bolivars, which are worthless because their economy there is a basket case. That was true in 2014 when this happened, still true today. But that means that from time to time, the Venezuelan government would hold auctions of US dollars for companies doing business in Venezuela to exchange their bolivars into dollars because nobody else in the world wants these things. So they had this auction in 2014, and Telefonica decided that what it would do is bribe government officials in Venezuela to get the lion's share of those US dollars that were coming to pass. The way that they worked it is that they asked two of the Telefonica's suppliers to bribe. They worked with an intermediary, as always, to bribe foreign government officials in Venezuela a total of $29 million. And the $29 million went from the suppliers to the intermediary into a shell company, and then some portion of that money went into the pockets of the corrupt government officials. Lo and behold, when the auction for US dollars happens, Telefonica wins 110 million of the total dollars that were available. That was about two-thirds of the whole pie, so they got the lion's share. And then to conceal the bribe and pay back their suppliers who had fronted the 29 million, they agreed to overinflated pricing to buy equipment from the suppliers. And they used some of the 110 million that they just got to pay off the suppliers and conceal the bribe. And here we are. So we have all the usual of sham contracting agreements, shell companies, intermediaries who aren't worth, the price, the paper of their contract, and everything else. Ultimately, this led to an $85 million criminal penalty for Telefonica because there was no voluntary self-disclosure. There was some slow walking of the investigation at initial stages, although ultimately they did come around and do a more fulsome cooperation later in the investigation. They've been doing some remediation. We can get to all that. And there's a 3-year deferred prosecution agreement with the usual now certification of the compliance program at the end of that 3-year term by the CCO and the CEO. And that pretty much sums up the facts of the case, at least. And there's some useful lessons in here.
Matt, I was really intrigued to start with by what I called in my blog post the double of a high risk jurisdiction with a high risk business, not necessarily a business model, but the telephone business is and should be viewed, at least in my opinion, as high risk because you're always going to be dealing with government officials to get a license. Now, I recognize in this case, it was not about getting a license, but I just thought the level of high risk was something that I'm not sure we really think about enough. Once again, just because it's high risk doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't do it. It just means you have to manage that risk higher. But you saw some interesting things as well. What were some of the key lessons learned, or at least the ones that stood out to you that we don't perhaps talk about as much?
I'll start first with what I put last in my post about this was the nature of the bribe scheme, where usually we see the company that is in question, they just deal with sketchy intermediaries and shell companies directly. And that is not what happened here. What happened is that Telefonica wedged an extra layer of obfuscation into this whole arrangement by having their suppliers work with the sketchy intermediaries and the shell companies. I have seen a couple of compliance officers commenting on this on LinkedIn, wondering, how am I supposed to handle this? Tom, you might know better than me, but don't think we have seen that many FCPA cases that involve suppliers of basic goods and services, which was the case here. We don't know who exactly these suppliers were, except that they are Venezuelan subsidiaries of global companies that make equipment for telecoms. These were not business consultants, these were not business agents or anything like that. These were just companies that made telecom infrastructure equipment and components. So, would a compliance officer now need to bring anti corruption due diligence procedures to that part of the supply chain as well? Now, I get it if you're dealing with agents or consultants or fixers or anything else like that, those sort of suppliers who, by their nature, seem like they are high risk and sketchy. You know enough and you know how to perform due diligence on them. But these are seemingly lower risk suppliers might be supplying phone booths or copper wire for phone wires, things like that. How would you manage to extend your due diligence to those people? You'd need to think through what are the ways the company procures its goods? What are the contracts that it signs with those suppliers? How are you going to work with the procurement team or the contract management team to get your due diligence concerns included in the sourcing of that? What if your company doesn't have a dedicated procurement function? Then think about how you would actually try and figure that out. Also, aside from that, you have to monitor these suppliers because what happened in this case was the suppliers were overcharging for whatever goods they would normally provide Telefonica. So, how would you actually be able to deduce this is an unusual transaction with our supplier as opposed to the normal ones? Maybe you are billing, they're billing you $100 a month after month, and suddenly it's $250 for another month. Is the compliance officer going to see that? Would you be able to get the documentation and evidence to understand why that happened? Those are the kind of things that compliance officers would need to think about here. Although I do worry that this might be an increasing concern in the future because it often now we see that supply chain issues are becoming compliance concerns. Usually that's been related to sanctions or cybersecurity or maybe even ESG issues, but this is a reminder that they can also be corruption issues that arise in your supply chain. And you're going to need this 360-degree risk assessment of these suppliers, including the very boring ones who are just providing, I don't know, basic goods that your company consumes. And so that was one big thing that jumped out to me.
Let me stop you there because that issue was actually written about in a publication called Compliance Week by a guy named Scott Moritz, I think in 2007, perhaps 2008. And what he was describing was the risk management process that Tyco went on or under with their procurement side because they had so many vendors in the supply chain. And I think it was hundreds of thousands. And they had to set up a realistic risk ranking system so that they could then begin to perform due diligence and winnow that down to their true high risk. If we take that approach, and frankly, I've used that approach since that time because it was the one that made logical sense on the supply side. But here we have a different set of risk parameters. Now, perhaps the fact that these are Venezuelan companies makes them per se high risk, even if they're suppliers. But for a compliance professional to get to the point where they begin to do due diligence, every company has 10 and sometimes 100 times the number of suppliers you have over sales agents, or at least third parties on the sales side of things. So you've got to figure out a way to figure out who the truly high risk ones are. But your second point of once, say you've identified them and say you put them through due diligence, now you have to look at individual pricing. And that is going to be, I don't want to say impossible because I don't want any of our brethren and sister and compliance professionals to think you're saying you can't do it, but it's going to be pretty close. Certainly you and I are not going to know what a reasonable price is. And if you're a compliance professional, you're not going to know the reasonable price of copper wiring in Venezuela. You can look at prior invoices, but as my financial advisor continually reminds me, past performance is no indication of future results. So, on the sales side of things, we saw a couple of FCPA enforcement actions where the bribe was baked into a massive contract price, particularly around PDVSA, but Petrobras, where he had $1 billion contract. And so it was almost impossible to tell what was the overcharge, which created the pot of money to pay the bribe. But on the supply chain side, this is going to be incredibly difficult. And since I read your blog post, I've really been trying to think of a way we could recommend that compliance professionals think about it outside the traditional approach, which you used for at least 20 years. And the only thing I could think of is, could the compliance function be made aware of areas where there's a huge gap in either here getting money out of a country like Venezuela or something else? For instance, we saw Ukraine years ago. We had an FCPA enforcement action where a company was trying to get a tax rebate paid. So where the company is owed money or something like that. But if we go through our traditional approach, which you completely articulated, I'm afraid it's going to be almost impossible to tell if the pricing is a way to hide the bribe.
I have a few thoughts there. First off, I do think that we should appreciate the complexity of all of this because I don't recall Scott Moritz's article from Compliance Week in 2007, although I probably would have read it since I was there at the time. I don't doubt that Scott would be right on top of something like this and probably have good advice. He would be correct that you need to take a risk based approach to your suppliers. On the other hand, when you're talking about a highly risky market like Venezuela, any business in Venezuela, they could swing a dead cat and hit at least four corrupt intermediaries and government officials. So every supplier in Venezuela is going to be high risk because could they find a sketchy intermediary? Of course they could. They just wave their hand and one will pull over. So that is going to be a challenge in particular markets. Then again, everybody would know that about Venezuela. Tom, to your point about how would a compliance officer try and get a read on what are these potentially bribe conduits baked into a larger contract with one of your suppliers. So what Telefonica had to do basically was hire a forensic accounting firm to quote overhaul Telefonica's approval process for transactions with non-standard pricing. That's what Telefonica had to do with the help of the forensic accounting firm. And then the compliance function has a review of all such transactions globally. So, yes, there are ways to be able to assess whether a transaction with your supplier has non-standard pricing. No, it is not easy. And most compliance teams will not have the expertise for this. I honestly think maybe a lot of accounting teams might not have expertise for this unless they bring in some forensics people on staff, which is not easy because forensic accountants are not cheap. So you would have to be thinking through where would we want to bring this level of analysis and detail and this expense, frankly, because you won't be able to do it in all markets. You could do it in some. And even then, you'd have to still be thinking about which of our suppliers who don't fit the usual risk profile could still be risky because they're in Venezuela or they're in China or they're in any number of other countries where, like I said, if they want to find a corrupt intermediary, all they have to do is wave their hand. That's this kind of thinking that a compliance team would need to do. And then to do it at scale, like, I don't know. If somebody's got a good solution, please call us up and we'll have you on the podcast in a couple of weeks because this strikes me as a very difficult challenge that is going to ping pong between the procurement team, the accounting team, the compliance team, with a healthy number of data analytics people floating around somewhere to help you out. That's not easy, but yet that's the sort of capability you would need to address this problem.
What do you see as our next lesson learned, Matt?
I also thought it was intriguing just to walk through how the Justice Department got to its $85 million criminal penalty. If you look at the standard sentencing guidelines, the US sentencing guidelines, the standard range of fines for a misconduct like this would be 101 to $203 million because of some of those aggravating factors I'd mentioned earlier, such as no voluntary self-disclosure, prior black mark on the civil side with the SEC in 2019, although no prior criminal history for Telefonica on the FCPA, slow start to cooperation and all of that. The Justice Department said that marked bumping it up from the minimum 101 to the fifth percentile, which is $106 million. And then, because of the good things that Telefonica had done, such as a lot of translation of documents, a lot of providing documents to the government as things went on, hiring a chief compliance officer who reports directly to the audit committee of the board, that overhaul of non-standard pricing with the forensic accounting team help and all of those mitigating factors then led to a reduction of 20% from that fifth percentile, 106 million. I know there's math involved here, listeners. Don't worry, we'll get you there. But 20% off of that 106 million gets you down to 85 million. Now, if in some parallel universe, Telefonica handled its case differently because it had a robust compliance function and it did voluntarily self-disclose and it did coordinate with and cooperate with the government from the very beginning, the numbers and the penalties would look much different. Yes, you'd still have that range of 101 to 203 million, but at least in theory, because Telefonica in that parallel universe would have hit all of the criteria for the compliance enforcement program, they would have been looking at a 50% deduction off of that 101 minimum, not 20% off of 106. Keep doing the math. 50% off 101 million, that would be a fine of $50.5 million. That's what that other Telefonica in the parallel world would have paid because it had a robust compliance program. That'd be a savings of $35 million compared to what we actually saw. Now, I know it's more complicated than that. I know this is just back of the envelope calculation, but I do think those calculations are useful for compliance officers because they do help you show to the CFO, to the board, and everybody else that a strong compliance function really can bring big financial benefits. It is not going to cost you $35 million a year to run a compliance program unless you're like Walmart. For most businesses, this is not going to be anywhere near as expensive as that. So compliance programs can pay for themselves. And let's just remember, the first two tenets of that enforcement program are voluntary self-disclosure and cooperation from the beginning. It doesn't say that those things are expensive. They are not expensive. They require just willpower from the corporation. Now, being able to mitigate and remediate your program, yes, there's real money there and everything else, but 2/3 of having a strong compliance program is essentially just executive willpower, which is free. You just need to have your heart and your mind in the right place and your ethical priorities in the right place. And if you do, from there, it gets much easier to save a lot of money on the potential fines that you're looking at for misconduct. Tom, I thought that was another important point just to underline yet again.
I absolutely agree, Matt. And your back of the envelope analysis, I think, is not only spot on, but that's exactly the analysis every compliance professional could do, including those of us that are math challenged, and more importantly, should do, because that's how the DOJ is going to think about it. And the mystery is always in how do they get to the sentencing range, because that goes through the opaqueness of the formulas in the sentencing guidelines. But once you get that range, you can easily see the discount that would have been available to Telefonica. And let's remind our listeners, this is not the first rodeo for Telefonica. This is not the first rodeo for Telefonica in Latin America, because their Brazilian subsidiary also had an FCPA enforcement action, I think in 2019. The company, at least those who oversee Latin America, should have been somewhat familiar with this, and they should have been familiar with the discounts that were available. And as you correctly noted, um, once you get notice that you're under investigation, cooperation doesn't cost very much. And that's just an attitude, and that's the tone at the top. So spot on all of those points from my perspective.
Tom, I suppose my
You have one
last
more, or do you want me to throw in mine?
Oh, go right ahead. And after that, I'll pose
Go
the
ahead.
question to you. What's yours?
So mine was, I called it the long tail of the FCPA because the bribes were paid in 2014. I speculated that the bribery scheme was developed in 2012 and 2013 in response to events that probably happened before that, which was Telefonica trying to get its money out of Venezuela. Even if you take the 2014 date for when the bribes were allegedly paid, that's still 10 years, 10 years to an enforcement action. There is a very long tail on FCPA enforcement action. Now, in our sort of last segment, you detailed perhaps one of the reasons the enforcement action took so long, and that was the lack of cooperation by Telefonica. But that just delays things even further. And the things that drive corporate CEOs the most insane that I ever saw was uncertainty. And if they make a screw up or they make a violation or they do a something, their response is typically, tell me what it's going to cost so I can reserve against it and let me move on. Here they could move on. They could move on for 10 years. And whether they knew about this in 2019 when they signed off on the prior settlement or not, people need to realize a 5-year statute of limitations doesn't mean it happened 5 years ago. It could happen a long time ago. And these long year tails, I think, are just devastating.
I think so too. And that led me to kind of wonder basically, are we still going to see enforcement actions like this in a Trump administration? Because the Trump administration is coming, and there are a lot of people who are still cynical about what FCPA enforcement would look like there. And I don't know. I mean, we should remember that FCPA enforcement continued throughout the first Trump administration, and I don't necessarily dismiss the idea that just because Trump himself seems like he's no fan of the FCPA, that we're not going to see FCPA enforcement anymore. I don't think that's true, and I do think that there are still cases like this that we're still going to see, and it does behoove companies to take this stuff seriously, no matter who is in charge right now, who is going to be in charge in 2025, and all of the other prognostications and doom and gloom about FCPA enforcement. I could see the nature of the punishments changing a bit, but I don't necessarily think that therefore means you don't have to worry about internal controls and anti corruption and it's just going to be a bribery party fest. I don't think that's the case at all. I know that's very early. And Tom, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I did look at this case and I wondered, would we still see this in another year or two's time? And I kind of think maybe yes. I don't know. What's your take?
As to this specific case, Matt, I think we'll absolutely see any case involving Venezuela, because I think this will be part of the Trump administration portfolio to punish Venezuela. And I
Hmm.
think they will target as much as they can and in many ways as they can companies doing business in countries they don't like for whatever reason. And so would not surprise me at all for countries who didn't toe the line, whatever that line may be, to have a pickup of FCPA cases. But with Venezuela, they are so corrupt, and the administrations of the United States, plural, have been at odds with Venezuela for so long that I would fully expect to see enforcement actions involving anything touching Venezuela going forward.
I agree. That's all
So
I
I
got.
cut you off before your final point. So what did you have for us?
No,
That's
that
what you
was my
got?
final point.
Turns out there was a lot in this case. Okay. It turns out there was a lot in this case, and I think there's a lot. And I'm just gonna reiterate Matt's clarion call. If you have some thoughts on how we can help the supply side of this equation going forward, please let us know.
Thank you, Tom.
So Matt, till next week.